morning, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I'm going to read the short bio as we introduce the speaker today. She's from New York University, and her colleague, you work together on this book?
Yes.
Is from Northwestern.
Yes.
So you are an assistant professor of political science in the Wolf Family Department of Politics at New York University, and her first book, Envy in Politics, was published by Princeton in 2018 as part of the Princeton Studies in Political Behavior series, and it examines the role of status concerns in shaping political participation and public opinion in South Africa and the United States. Her academic research has also been published in a variety of academic journals, and she received her PhD in politics from Princeton University and is a recipient of the 2013 Gabriel Almond Award in Comparative Politics. And I'm going to read a short description of what you're going to present today, if that's okay.
Okay, sure.
So, the title of today's event is From Pews to Politics in Africa and Beyond. And some of the questions that she's going to engage with are: do religious teachings influence political engagements? Under what conditions? To what extent and to what end? So this is, I assume this is taken from your book.
Yes.
So in this, the book, the two authors take a new look at whether, how, and to what extent religious teachings might shape the mindsets and behavior of citizens, and thereby influence their approaches to political engagement. And I think from this book, your data collection was based mainly in Nairobi and Johannesburg.
There's a lot of it, yes.
Okay, so welcome to the BIA. You're going to speak maybe for about 45 minutes or so, 45 minutes to 1 hour. Then we'll have questions and answer session for about 45 minutes to 1 hour. After that, I'll be passing the mic after she speaks, but the main reason I'm passing the mic is not for voice projection, but because we are doing recordings of these sessions. So thank you very much and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Santasana, for having me today. I'm not used to using the mic, especially in a small room like this, so you'll forgive me if I forget at times. Rachel Riedel, my co-author from Northwestern, couldn't be here today, but she sends her regards and looks forward to your feedback on this project. So this is a book manuscript, a book project that Rachel and I have been working on now for a number of years, and as was mentioned, some of the data collection happened in Nairobi, including with the help of some research assistants affiliated with BIEA. So we wanted to come and share some of the findings and the arguments from this project, and to get your feedback at this stage as we're still putting together the book manuscript. Broadly, one of our motivations for this book project is that as we look at media coverage and discourse around the world, we often see a connection drawn between exposure to religious teachings and political engagement. So we often see political engagement, the willingness to participate in protests, to run for office, to vote in a particular way, connected to the religious teachings that people have been exposed to. So anywhere from discussions in the last even in last year of sermons delivered in Zimbabwe being connected to participation in anti-regime protests, to the discussions of Friday sermons mobilizing people into a protest in Tahrir Square around the Arab Spring, to going back to the 1980s, the connection perhaps between sermons that were delivered by some Catholic priests and participation in Polish solidarity, the role of Christian teachings and sermons in mobilizing people into the U.S. Civil rights movement. But so Rachel and I are trained as political scientists, so you'll forgive our disciplinary biases perhaps, but we look around at the literature from political scientists and find that they're often not paying much attention to religious teachings per se, and are in fact quite skeptical of making any type of causal claims about the role of religious teachings in motivating political behavior. And this is for a number of reasons. Often people are skeptical because, to some extent, at least within larger faith traditions, that is to say within Christianity, within Islam, individuals have some degree of choice over which house of worship in particular they might regularly attend, whether it's with family or friends or on their own. And to the extent that people might be selecting into exposure to religious teachings based on their pre-existing political inclinations, what they're exposed to in a house of worship might only really be a symptom of their inclinations of how they want to participate in politics, rather than a driving force pulling them into politics in a particular way. There's nothing that requires people to listen to what they hear in sermons, and so they also may sort of disconnect what they hear from the pulpit to what they hear to what they do in the political arena, or they may dismiss sort of explicit political directions from the pulpit, viewing this as not exactly the purview of religious leaders. So for a variety of reasons, political scientists have been very skeptical about making any causal claims about the relationship of exposure to religious teachings on modes of political engagement. So we're motivated in this project to try and think a bit more deeply about the ways in which religious teachings might influence the way that people engage in politics. Again, we're struck from a disciplinary perspective by the extent to which political scientists have, particularly in the study of politics in sub-Saharan Africa, paid very little attention to the role of religious teachings in particular. So even when we look globally, work on religion and politics often tends to focus on other aspects of the religious experience. So the social networks that people are exposed to in church, the organizational resources that they might gain, the skills, the sense of social identity, a social identity connection to their religious practice and religious faith, but not explicitly on the content of what is spoken from the pulpit or the content of religious teachings. In the study of African politics, we're also struck again by the extent to which when people pay attention to the role of religion in politics, it's often, again, through a social identity lens. And this is often in work that is done in places like Cote d'Ivoire or Nigeria, where there have been strongly politicized identity cleavages across religious lines, so between Christians and Muslims, for instance, in Nigeria. But again, not a lot of attention to the content, again, of what is said by religious leaders from the pulpit to their adherents, and the implications that might have for how people engage in politics. Now, there are some exceptions. Ruth Marshall, for instance, has written extensively about the content of Pentecostalism in Nigeria. A few authors have paid attention to religious teachings across denominations, even in the context of Kenya. As you'll see in the presentation, we use different methods than these authors to get at some of these questions. But these authors also point to the variations in religious teachings and hint at what the political implications might be of differences in content, particularly across denominations. And so we view our project here as, in many ways, complementary to these arguments. That is, we're taking these studies that are really rich ethnographic and case study research on particular churches and trying to expand or widen the lens of data collection across a greater swath and variety of churches to try and understand, again, what is being said from the pulpit and what the implications broadly might be of this for modes of political engagement. So in the project, as was mentioned, our core research questions are, do religious teachings, that is the content of what is said from the pulpit, influence political engagement? To what extent and to what end? Now, we view these also as going back, again, taking a very wide lens, going back to very long-standing questions within both sociology and political science, even going back to the 19th century, where Weber had an argument about the content of Protestantism in contrast to the content of what was being preached in Catholic churches during just after the Reformation in Europe, and that this might have implications. The content, again, of these teachings might have implications for behavior in non-religious domains, particularly in the domain of economic behavior in Weber's argument. By contrast, Durkheim at the same time was writing about religion less as a driving force of behavior outside of the religious sphere, and rather as a sort of symptom of social arrangements and political arrangements. And so again, we're trying to engage with the possibility, sort of more on the Weberian side, that the content of religious teachings might not just be a symptom of people's political and social inclinations, but also a driving force in shaping the mode through which people engage in politics. So what we'd like to argue in this book is that exposure to religious teachings, and here we're going to focus specifically on Christian sermons, that they can influence not just whether people engage in politics or not, even, and this is crucial here, even when the sermons are not themselves explicitly political. That is, the content of religious teachings could influence whether and how people engage in politics, even when religious leaders are not saying explicitly, this is how you should engage in politics, this is whom you should vote for, this is what you should do when it comes to the political arena. We're going to argue not only that religious teachings can shape not only the level of political participation, that is, whether people are energized to participate in politics, but also how they participate in politics. And we're going to argue in particular that one possible pattern is that religious teachings could influence whether people participate in politics to pursue political change through personal transformation, that is, through character building, faith building, values building, through leaders, and even engaging in leadership development, trying to be themselves, that is, trying to become possible leaders, even to run for office themselves as adherents, or, by contrast, whether they engage in politics to pursue sort of institutional or structural reform. Right? That these are two very different ways of looking at how political change needs to happen, and that religious teachings, by offering, we argue, sort of metaphysical understandings of how the world works, how this world works, how the next world or the spiritual world works, can influence which of these modes of political engagement people take on. And therefore that the content of the sermon matters. So we're going to highlight variation in how sermons describe the sources of problems in this world, that is, what is causing things like poverty, inequality, suffering, and also how sermons describe the possibilities for change, that is, whether change can happen in this world, or whether it's unlikely that much will change in the earthly sphere, and rather that we should wait for change to come in heaven in the afterlife. We're also going to argue, actually, that the duration of sermons' impact, that is, how long they influence people's ways of thinking about the world and engaging in politics, may actually be relatively short. That is, if you can imagine, if you go to church regularly, if you go to a house of worship regularly, that the influence of the sermon might only last, we're going to argue, even for a couple of days. Suggesting a sort of rationale for encouraging constant reinforcement of the sermon's message, that is, constant exposure to sort of in order to strengthen this link between the sermon and one's worldview, or that the implications of sermon exposure for political behavior might be strongest, again, in the short term, and might, again, again show up, the effects might show up most obviously even in just, again, the few days after people are exposed to a particular sermon. So the book looks like this. There are 7 chapters in the book. We begin with an introduction to give the overview of our argument and motivation as well as our methods. We give some background. Again, this is particularly for political scientists, maybe particularly in U.S. institutions who may not know as much about sort of the history of different Christian denominations within sub-Saharan Africa. We then describe our efforts to collect information and describe differences in contemporary sermon content. That is, we didn't want to assume anything in advance about what it is that churches are actually saying from the pulpit, and instead set out to try and describe some of those differences in content ourselves. We then engage in 3 different chapters trying to tease out the implications of sermon exposure, so exposure to these different types of sermon content on people's political behavior. We do this in a variety of ways. We work with the Busara Center here for Behavioral Economics in Nairobi to run a series of lab experiments in which people were randomly assigned to listen to different types of sermon content, and we then looked at the implications for their different types of political behavior. We looked broadly across sub-Saharan Africa at different large-scale surveys to look at the implications of sermon exposure on reported political behavior. We also conducted a variety of focus groups, particularly here in Nairobi, also in Johannesburg, where we collected some of the sermon information as well. And we engaged in several different case studies across time and across countries to look at whether there have been different patterns of political engagement across denominations that are delivering very different types of sermons. And then we go into some of the implications and conclusions. So today I want to touch a little bit on these empirical chapters. I'm only going to be able to give a little bit of a taste of each one, but I'm happy to answer any additional questions that you might have about what is in those chapters. So we did much of this work in Nairobi itself. We also did extensive data collection in Johannesburg, as well as some a bit more cursory work in places like Accra, Kampala, and Lagos. I will again focus this presentation on the work that was done in Nairobi for the purposes of this audience, but happy to answer questions additionally about those other efforts. So why do some of this work in Nairobi? On the one hand, part of the motivation is because we have a fairly representative, at least as we look across different cities in sub-Saharan Africa, representative presence of different Christian denominations concentrated within Nairobi. So for the purposes of trying to describe and maximize variation in sermon content, this was a good place to start. We were interested in a place where we had high levels of socioeconomic diversity, that is where we could capture information from churches that were ranging anywhere from really large-scale mega churches to smaller, pop-up churches, long-standing churches, newer churches, churches that catered to poorer congregations, richer congregations, that would exhibit high variety in ethnic diversity and the like. Again, to try and maximize the differences in sermon content across the churches that we observed. We also actually wanted to be in a place where where religion was again, can overlap with other politicized social identity cleavages like tribe, language, but that it is not the primary identity cleavage that is politicized. That is to say, again, working in a place like Kenya and Nairobi, where we knew that other social identity cleavages, tribe in particular, were highly politicized, have been documented to be highly correlated with vote choice, place, even with violence and the like, that again we were interested in a place where religion was not the primary source of that politicization, again for the purposes of thinking about the larger literature on African politics, which has mostly, if ever paid attention to religion, has paid attention to it as a kind of social identity cleavage. Here, what we want to argue in part is even where religion is not highly politicized, as sort of the most politicized social identity cleavage, we should still be paying attention to its role in politics, in part, again, because of the content of what is being communicated from the pulpit. We also thought, again, that following the 2007 elections and aftermath, that the church services, that religious leaders might be a bit wary about being explicitly political in their worship services. That is to be seen as stoking ethnic tensions in any way. So we thought that the church services might be particularly likely in this time period to be not to be particularly explicitly political. Again, the purpose of the research trying to argue that even when religious content is not explicitly political, even when religion is not the most politicized social identity cleavage, that we still need to be paying attention to the content of what's communicated from the pulpit in order to understand patterns of political engagement. So again, we didn't want to assume in advance that we knew, based on the types of churches, that we knew what they were communicating to congregants from the pulpit. And so we set out to collect information about worship services, about what was being said, about the content of the sermons across a variety of churches. So what we did was in Nairobi specifically, we used Google Earth as a sampling frame. We didn't want to work off of registration lists because some churches are not explicitly registered. There may be, anyway, a variety of issues with working from those lists. So we used Google Earth as the sampling frame. We from that drew the full list of any church that is listed in Nairobi or picked up in Google Earth in Nairobi. From that, we then randomly sampled from that list to get to sample about 200 churches from the city. We tried, based on their names, to oversample Pentecostal churches because we thought, again, so Pentecostal churches are not as centralized as, say, Catholic churches. They can, there are some federations, obviously, the Pentecostal Assemblies of God and the like, but many of them can appear without the sanctioning of any centralized authority. And so we thought among Pentecostal churches we might find wide variation in what they were saying in their sermons. And so we tried to oversample the Pentecostal churches in order to pick up any variation across Pentecostal churches in what they were saying from the pulpit. So we, again, randomly sampled from the Google Earth list to get a list of 200 churches that were a mixture of Pentecostal, mainline Protestant, and Catholic churches for the most part. We then, along with research assistants, so the initial observations that we did were from 2013, 2014, with the help of some who are in the room, Wangela, doing a lot of that initial data collection work along with us and another research assistant. We endeavored to visit every one of these churches, both to interview the pastors or priests, but also to attend the worship services, to take copious notes on the content of the sermons. In some cases, some of these churches record their sermons as a matter of course, even make those available online. In that case, we were able to collect more than one sermon from that particular church. So we initially did the initial visits of Pentecostal churches in 2013, 2014, and then visited the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches churches in 2016. We did the initial data collection for, again, 2013 to 2016, which meant that we were outside of any intense electoral period, and so we then revisited each of those churches in 2017, again with the help of some who are here and affiliated with BIEA. So overall, we collected 179 sermon texts, along with observations of the content of those worship services. So some of what we found in the context of that effort is that as we expected, somewhat ex ante, that the sermons were rarely explicitly political. That is, rarely, certainly within the sermon, but even within the worship service itself, were specific candidates endorsed, mentioned, specific policy issues endorsed or mentioned, specific parties and the like explicitly mentioned. The exception, again, which is in keeping with our expectations following 2007 and subsequent elections, is that during the 2017 period there was many prayers for peace. So there were explicit mention of the elections and of upcoming elections. And this was across all different types of churches, but that was sort of the extent of explicit political discourse during that period. We also were perhaps somewhat surprised, again, given the wide variation in types of Pentecostal churches and the decentralization of those churches, found very few sort of stark thematic differences among the Pentecostal churches or among mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons, but rather we argue in the book found fairly stark differences between Pentecostal sermons on the one hand and then mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons on the other. And we describe those differences as follows. So we characterize these differences as what we call sort of metaphysical differences. That is, very different views about how the world works, or how the physical world works and how the spiritual world works. And in particular, we found differences in the extent to which the sermons located the source of problems in this world, that is poverty, inequality, suffering, within the individual. That is, attributing the problems of the world to the strength of faith of individuals, the characters of individuals, their relationships with God. And we found the Pentecostal sermons, again, with very little variation among them, to be quite high on that dimension. That is, again, locating the source of poverty and problems in this world within the individual. That is, the individual's own strength of faith and own character. By contrast, the mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons on the whole mentioned individual characteristics, but paid much more attention to the sources of earthly problems in relationship, in things external to the individual. That is, in the nature of relationships between people, in sort of notions of culture, in institutions, and the like. The other dimension that we highlight that the sermons seem to also differ along is in the extent to which they sort of promise that material change can happen in this world imminently. And so Pentecostal sermons we found quite high again on this dimension, which is promising that, especially again with an increase in strength of faith, that material change can and will happen imminently in this life. Whereas in the mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons, we found a much lower lower sort of possibility of change therein promised, meaning that one should act rightly, one should act with faith, and so on and so forth. But this doesn't necessarily mean that change will happen in this life, even if it's rewarded in the next. So this is in keeping somewhat with the characterization, as others have written, about the prosperity gospel in the Pentecostal sermons. Again, the locating of the source of suffering and problems within the individual and the individual's relationship with God, and promising that material change can and will happen in this world. So an example of this might even be, again, we highlight this in part because around even the same passages of Scripture, we found very different takes within the sermons, or very different interpretations. So even in discussing the book of Job, we found it very interesting that the sermons, when they mentioned these passages of Scripture, would focus on very different things. And so the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches would often discuss Job's suffering not due to like his own character or strength of faith, but rather, that even good people, right, even people of faith, are going to be tested, right, by things external to them, even by the devil, by Satan, etc. And that these are things that one can't necessarily escape, right? That material change we can't necessarily overcome suffering, but rather that this is something to be endured with faith. By contrast, again, we found very interesting in the Pentecostal sermons more of a focus even on very specific lines from or verses from the book of Job. There's a verse in which Job's friend says, essentially, you need to strengthen your own faith, right? You decree a thing and it will be established for you. And the discussion of the book of Job often much more about whether Job himself could strengthen his faith and therefore see change in his life, again, for himself and socially around him. So just to give a few more examples, in the Pentecostal sermons, we're seeing messages about, it's how you see yourself that matters. If you see yourself as a lion, you will roar and you won't be intimidated. Again, focusing on aspects internal to individuals and the imminent promise of material change if those things are addressed. Grace will deliver you miracles, right? You can do without systems, right? You don't need sort of institutions. You don't even necessarily need, sort of patronage or relationships with other people. If you tap into your faith, God will pick you up as a shepherd boy and bring you into a place of significance. The mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons, again, on the whole, much more focused on sort of the limited possibilities, no necessary promise of material change, and yet, sort of a focus on, discussion of social justice, of righting institutions, of righting relationships among people, not necessarily, again, because those things will imminently change, but rather because addressing them might mean rewards or coming home in the next life. So we posit in the book that these metaphysical takes, so these understandings of the physical and spiritual world, could have very different implications for how people engage in politics. And that to the extent that one is exposed to sermons that locate the problems of the world within the individual, that people exposed to these sermons might be more likely to see political problems, again, as rooted in the individual, in character and faith, and focus on those things as the things that need to be changed. That is, the characters of leaders, the strength of faith of leaders, maybe even, again, getting themselves or people from their church to run for office, to, again, seek political political change through personal transformation. By contrast, when people exposed to sermons that locate the source of earthly problems and things external to the individual might be, again, on average, more likely to see political problems as rooted in institutions and structures, in things, in sort of things that need to be reformed structurally in order to see political change. Along this dimension, we posit that the promise of imminent change in this world might have implications for people's sense of efficacy. That is, how empowered, how energized they feel to seek political change in one or the other of these modes. So again, in the book, so empirically, within Nairobi, we argue sort of instances of these two quadrants, right? That is sort of the high promise of earthly change along with locating problems within the individual, or a focus on things external to the individual and sort of a low probability of change. But within the larger book and sort of looking around the world, we think that religious teachings could easily fall in any of these quadrants, or even along other schema. And we argue that where the religious teachings fall in this quadrants has implications, again, for how people engage in politics. So we argue that those exposed to religious teachings in this quadrant might be more likely to be sort of empowered players of the existing game, that is, seeking personal transformation, right? Leadership training, recruitment, guiding and trying to persuade and convert public officials, but not necessarily critiquing or criticizing existing structures or institutions, and that those in this quadrant might be less sort of energized or feel less sort of empowered, a bit more fatalistic about what's going on in the world. But to the extent that they engage in politics, might be more likely to sort of critique structures and institutions. So again, within this empirical context, we're focused more on this diagonal rather than the others. So to give an example of this, sort of arguing, and this is partly outside of Kenya, but the quote from Nevers Mumba in Zambia, we think sort of illustrates this kind of approach, which is it's not about institutions, right? It's good governance takes good governors, right? Our hope, right, for political change is to insist on putting into office leaders of proven morality, right, whose values are faith-based and anchored in godly values. Now, the opposite approach is not to say that we wouldn't, also like leaders of high morality, but also to say that we also need sort of, economic, institutional, social justice type of reforms, because if we get people who are not of high morality, we need to have better systems in place to put checks, right? Change the extrinsic incentives, right? To put checks on leaders through institutions, through accountability, through monitoring, rather than through personal transformation. So part of the empirical work in the book is to try and then grapple with, can we find any evidence of the kinds of consequences that I just posited to you? And one of the strategies that we pursue is to take some of these questions to the lab. So the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics is here in Nairobi and invites adult residents of Nairobi to come and take part in behavioral economics, political science, psychology, different types of experiments. The reason that we bring it to the lab is because, again, the political science skepticism about making any of these claims is in part that people have some choice over whether and how often they're exposed to different types of religious teachings. religiosity or religious practice also is a bundle of things, right? It's not just what you hear from the pulpit, but it's also the social experience, the resources, the networks and social identity, again, as I mentioned, that come with religious practice. What we can do in the lab is to get around some of these self-selection issues by randomly assigning the messages to people in the lab. We can also know exactly what the content is that they're being exposed to, and we can separate that from other aspects of religious experience. So what we did was, over a series of time periods, a series of studies, we invited over 1,000 Christian residents of Nairobi, of various denominations, who affiliate with various houses of worship, to come to the Busara Center. We then randomly assigned these participants to listen to audio recordings that were based on real-world sermons that came from our descriptive data collection that I mentioned earlier. So these were re-recorded by the same person in both English and in Kiswahili to provide, again, consistency in delivery and tone, so the differences across the treatment conditions are in the content. And some participants listen to sort of secular control messages, so either messages where it was the same sermon but removed references to Jesus, the Bible, to God, to make them somewhat more secular sounding, or they were assigned to a secular weather report message, which is a realistic message that you might be exposed to, but invokes none of the religious content that I've mentioned. So the setup is something like this, where people are sitting in separate cubicles. So again, it's removing the sort of social aspects of participating in a worship service. And everybody has headsets in the lab, and they're again randomly assigned to listen to either a Pentecostal-like sermon that is drawn from the real sermons that we observed, or for a mainline Protestant or Catholic sermon. So briefly, again, so that I can try and touch on some of the other empirical aspects of the project, what we found in the lab was that exposure to the Pentecostal sermon increased levels of political participation. So, for instance, after the lab experiment, we gave people the opportunity to participate in a political text message campaign in which they could text in what it is that they wanted from the government or what they thought that the government should prioritize. We see much higher levels of participation in that text message campaign from people who were exposed to the Pentecostal sermon. We can also look at the content of that participation. So the kinds of texts, for instance, that they were sending were focused on sort of leadership opportunities. So the text might offer themselves as interested in leadership development type institutes, or whether there were positions that they could take up in the government. They would also mention that they wanted deeper Christian values and morality from leaders. We also had people play or engage in tasks in the lab in which they had to either act as a politician, and they were given a certain amount of tax money that they then had to decide how much to spend back on the citizen in the lab. We found that those exposed to the Pentecostal sermons were much more trusting of politicians to spend a lot of money. That is, they didn't engage in any punishment behavior that they were allowed to engage in the lab. And they themselves, when put in the position of the politician, behaved much more generously towards other participants in the lab who were acting as the citizens, even when they didn't expect any kind of punishment from those other players. So we take this as some indication that those exposed to these sermons were much more focused on the kind of intrinsic incentives, that is the individual characteristics of leaders to engage in good governance rather than in sort of institutions or punishment type mechanisms to try and corral politicians into better behavior. Among those exposed to the mainline Protestant Catholic type sermon, we do not see very high levels of participation in the text message campaign after exposure to these sermons, in contrast to those exposed to the Pentecostal sermon. When they do send text messages, they're much more likely to mention particular laws that they would like changed, whether they liked the 2010 Constitution, for instance, whether they think there should be campaign finance laws was an example of one of the texts. And when engaging in these politician-citizen tasks, they were much less generous as the politicians when they were in that role, but much more punishing as the citizens. That is, they would reject levels of spending on the part of the politician players at much higher rates, even at a cost to themselves. So we, again, view this as behavior indicative of a focus on, again, sort of institutions, laws, extrinsic incentives to keep politicians in line, rather than relying on the strength of character of those politicians. But the lab has many disadvantages, as you can probably guess. So again, it's only in Nairobi. It's sort of a convenient sample of people who want to participate in these kinds of studies in the Busara Center. We wanted to ask whether these patterns extend, beyond this setting, even beyond Nairobi, beyond Kenya. We also wanted to understand whether these kind of individual patterns that we're picking up in the lab might extend to group level behavior. That is, do we see Pentecostals in general or mainline Protestants and Catholics in general engaging in different modes of political behavior? So to address these questions, we looked at different surveys that have been conducted across countries within sub-Saharan Africa and that ask for the religious affiliation or identification of respondents. And we also conducted case studies of, again, group level, that is Pentecostal, mainline Protestant, and Catholic engagement across different administrations and regimes in Zambia, Uganda, and Kenya. And I'll say something about why those particular places. Excuse me. So when looking at the survey data, excuse me, as I lose my voice, in looking at the survey data, what we were interested in is whether we see, so knowing something now about what kinds of sermons are being delivered in Pentecostal, mainline, and Catholic churches, we were interested in the extent to which in the surveys we would see those who identify as Pentecostals and those who identify as mainline Protestants and Catholics exhibiting different types of political inclinations and political behavior. So one of the things that we thought might be affected by the sermons were reports of political self-efficacy. So these surveys ask people, is politics something that somebody like you can understand? Does the government listen to people like you? And these are measures of sort of political efficacy, how much you think you can engage in and change the political environment. So what we found in looking, so we also know in these sermons the day of the week on which people were interviewed. And so controlling for some observable correlates of the day of the week on which people were interviewed and also their denominational affiliation, what we see is that on Sundays and Mondays only, we see a higher level of reported political self-efficacy among Pentecostals than we do among mainline Protestants and Catholics. Again, this persists into Monday, and then the two converge again. Similarly, So this is from a different sermon where the interviews were mostly taking place during church services, so we don't really know what to make of this particular data point. But what it's measuring here is there's an index that asks people how fair they think different institutions are, how much they think different laws are applied equally across citizens. And what we see is, again, particularly on Mondays, so just after Sunday worship services, we see mainline Catholics and Protestants much more critical of these types of institutions and the applications of laws than Pentecostals. And then, again, a fairly quick convergence during the course of the week. In general, across these surveys, what we find is that consistently early on in the week, and only early on in the week, Pentecostals exhibit, compared to mainline Protestants and Catholics, higher levels of political efficacy, stronger views that the system is fair, that laws are equally applied, that institutions are fair, a lower willingness to criticize sort of the government or the state as a whole, a lower willingness to engage in things like protest or refusal to pay taxes, but a greater willingness to approach public officials, that is to make requests or to report issues with public services. By contrast, mainline Protestants and Catholics early on in the week, we see stronger views that the system is unfair, that is, that laws are unequally applied, that institutions are problematic, a higher willingness to criticize the government or the state as a whole, and a greater willingness to inclinations to join a protest or to refuse to pay taxes. And by the way, again, no boost in political efficacy. So what we see here is sort of again, we had posited, based on exposure to religious teachings, these different modes of political engagement. That is, on the one hand, sort of energized, political, efficacious mode that is focused less on institutions than on working through individual leaders. And on the other hand, a less energized, more reluctant mode of political participation that is more focused on institutions and structural problems with the state as a whole. And what we see is this showing up, this difference in survey data, right after exposure or attendance at Sunday services, and then a pretty quick reconvergence later on in the week. That is, we see these effects sort of persisting into the first few days of the week and then quickly diminishing. Now, for those who report in the survey, so in some of these surveys they ask if you participate more than once, right, during the week, right? Do you go to midweek services? Do you go to Wednesday or Thursday prayer and worship services? And for those who report that they do this more than once a week, we see these divergences appear early on in the week, and then again later on in the week. We think, again, consistent with the idea that some of these sort of a focus on your understanding, your spiritual understanding of this world and the next world might be difficult to sustain in your everyday, as you return to the business of everyday life. And as you're exposed to sermons, they influence your worldview and your approach to politics, but these can decay, these effects can decay and be sort of recharged or re-upped by additional exposure to these sermons. So again, people's political inclinations can be shaped, we would argue, by religious teachings, but they may be most shaped by these religious teachings shortly after religious services. This has sort of interesting implications for the political opportunities that are offered just after services. So here, an example of the Monday protests in Kenya, but also more generally, these is a picture of what are called moral Mondays in the U.S., where we see large-scale religious protests happening early on in the week. We think these are the kinds of political opportunities that are most likely to reflect these differences in exposure to religious teachings. And for people who attend services often, right, or who listen to sermons often outside of church, we expect that the relationship between religious teachings and political behavior will be more consistent and more robust. Now, let me just say, lastly, a little bit, because I want to move on to Q&A, but a little bit about the final leg of the empirical work in the book, which is to try again and get at whether there are reflections of these patterns in group-level behavior, that is, of patterns of political engagement across Pentecostals, mainline Protestants, and Catholics in a variety of settings. The way that we do this is to engage in a method of agreement or most different case comparison design. Now we do this in part because there are other, once we move to the group level in particular, there are lots of other explanations that you might posit, you may already have in your minds of what might explain differential patterns across denominations and their modes of political engagement. For instance, you might expect that the extent to which any particular set of churches, or the Catholic Church or mainline Protestant churches or Pentecostal churches, are sort of close to the state, that is, if there's a president in power who is affiliated with one of those denominations or is otherwise favoring any of those denominations, we might expect different modes of political engagement from that set of churches. Perhaps the closer they are to state power, the less likely they are to criticize institutions and state structures, or you could, I suppose, posit the reverse. It might also matter, how centralized or hierarchical those churches are. That is, the centralization and hierarchy might have implications for whether churches can sort of come together and engage in the kind of push for structural reform that we've argued is characteristic of mainline Protestant and Catholic churches. How strong their international ties are to churches outside of the local context might matter, or their extent of service provision might have implications for whether people are brought together frequently in the context of providing services, and therefore might be able to engage in different forms of political engagement. So what we try and do is leverage a most different comparison design, which means that across the cases that we look at, we have wide variation across denominations in each of these variables. So we have variation across regimes in the extent to which the Catholic Church, the mainline Protestant churches, or the Pentecostal churches are sort of close to state power. We have variation among the mainline Protestant churches as to how centralized or hierarchical they are. Variation across Pentecostal and mainline Protestant churches across cases in the extent of their international ties, and some instances, particularly the case of Zambia, where we have higher levels of Pentecostal engagement in service provision. And our argument here is that despite all of this variation, we see consistent modes of political engagement across denominations. So to give an example, we've tried to pick cases that give us variation, again, in these types of variables, that is, in the extent to which any of the denominations in different regime periods have been sort of close to state power, as well as their variation in centralization, hierarchy, international ties, and service provision. And our argument here is that despite, again, all of this variation across time periods, that we see very consistent modes of political engagement. That is, we consistently see, again, relatively speaking, the Catholic churches, even Catholic laity, even absent the Catholic leadership, mainline Protestants, engaging in a focus on problems with institutions, structures, legislation, pushing for change in all of these arenas. And consistently across all these cases, Pentecostal clergy, so Pentecostal leaders and lay members, consistently publicly focusing on leadership development. That is, rather than changing institutions, focused on critiquing the characters and strength of faith of individual leaders, on trying to cultivate leadership potential within their own ranks, trying to, again, get Christians of strong values into government as a way to pursue political change in contrast to institutional or structural change. So I just want to end with a few notes, which is that, again, as I mentioned at the start, I think our arguments find complements in some of the really rich ethnographic and case study work that has been done. So for instance, Marshall in her book on Pentecostalism in Nigeria describes what she calls, so to the extent that she sees a political project within Pentecostalism, a kind of program of conversion. That is her interpretation, is that for Pentecostals, it's not structures, right, that really, or institutions really that matter, right? Like political structures in and of themselves are neither more or less legitimate, right? Instead, it's about personal transformation, right? Conversion, right? The strengthening of faith and of individual character is a means of creating both the ideal citizen, and we would add the sort of the ideal leader, one who can provide a living incarnation of the nomos of an ordered political realm, right? So political change is through personal transformations of citizens and leaders rather than through institutional change. So we too would argue that the religious teachings of both, again, contemporary Pentecostal sermons and contemporary mainline and Catholic sermons have implications for their adherents' approaches to politics, at least sort of in the short term, or as sort of recharged over time. And that, political change on the one hand might be pursued through sort of political transformation or conversion, on the other hand, also through structural reform. Again, I just want to highlight here that we have this schema in thinking about religious teachings, and we worked mostly along this diagonal in this empirical context, but we are suggesting in the book that this schema could shed light on a variety of religious teachings around the world across all four quadrants. And most, basically what we want to argue in the book is that by providing metaphysical instruction, that is understandings of how the world works and the possibilities of change, religious teachings can influence political participation even when they're not explicitly political, right? So even when they're not giving explicit direction, this is what you should do in politics. And so especially when reinforced, right, over time, or connected to immediate political opportunities, this kind of influence can explain important variation in how people pursue political change. Okay, I will stop there and welcome your questions.
Hi, thank you very much. That was really interesting. I have a few questions, and my first question is, you, in one of your slides, you talked about job, and I was wondering, how did you manage to get the same sermon in different churches, or did you in any way influence the what was going to be read in the church? Or then my next question is, as you sampled through the mainline churches and Pentecostal churches, did you also consider the level of education, and also in these different churches, and also the economic status of different people who are attending these different churches? I had a third one, but I don't remember just now.
Okay. Well, if it comes to you, feel free to ask. Shall I answer, or you want to collect? Okay. Yeah, so great question. So we tried as much as possible not to influence what was going to be discussed in the sermons. Now, you can imagine myself, Rachel's also a white woman from the US, right? Like, we're kind of stand out in some of the churches, not in others. It depends on some of the big mega churches, we can go in and sort of nobody notices. In other instances, people know, and we were also interviewing the pastors or the priests of the churches, so they, and in cases, knew about the project. But what we tried to do was, again, either when it was Rachel or myself going to attend a worship service, to speak to the pastor sort of maybe just before to introduce ourselves, but to do the interview afterwards. Our perception was that this didn't do much, again, since it was in the immediate term of attending the worship service, change much in the way of what was going to be spoken about in the sermons. And then we also had a variety of very capable research assistants who attended many of these services, by far the vast majority of the services, to collect information on the sermon text, and so were much less likely to influence what was said. Now, it was very interesting to us that so we didn't ask the priests or pastors to discuss a particular passage of Scripture and see how they discussed it differently. Nevertheless, in part because of the liturgical calendar, which Pentecostal churches adhere to less strictly than Catholic or mainline Protestant churches, but some of the same passages of Scripture came up over and over again in all of these different types of churches. So the story of David and Goliath is also one that often comes up in each of these different types of churches, but is discussed very differently. And the sort of interpretation of the passage of Scripture we found to be quite different in keeping with this schema that we've put forward. So we bring this forward as an illustration in a way to show you that, again, it's not so much that the churches are discussing different topics or different passages of Scripture altogether, but rather, even around the same passages of Scripture, having a very different understanding that is being communicated of how the world works and God's relationship with the world and with members of the congregation. Again, one of the reasons we focused on Nairobi as one of the starting points of the data collection is because we knew that we would get churches of very different levels of education and socioeconomic status. So when we were visiting the worship services or interviewing the pastors and priests, we asked questions about the makeup of the congregation so that we could sort of track which sermons were coming from churches that were catering to more predominantly poor congregations, sort of mixed income congregations, much more wealthy congregations, as well as along levels of education. What we were surprised by was that within the sort of category of, say, Pentecostalism or mainline and Catholic churches, we did not see much variation based on the type of church on these kinds of thematic differences. That is, regardless of whether the Pentecostal church was predominantly poor, predominantly much more wealthy, a huge megachurch or a tiny church, in say Kibera or somewhere, they discuss these in very similar terms. So the message that suffering and poverty and all the problems in this world can be overcome, but are also sourced in individual faith and one's relationship with God was consistent across all of these types of churches. So we tried to set out actually to find as much variation as we could based on all of these different characteristics, and yet the big differences that we found were across these church categories rather than along these kinds of socioeconomic indicators. Yes.
Okay.
Sorry, can you tell me your name too so that I know?
My name is Frida.
Frida, thank you for your question, Frida.
So I'm Richard.
Yes, Richard.
Okay, some months leading to the election, usually we are always preoccupied by this by the fear of violence that will recur in every election. So I would presume that will dominate the discussion or the sermons in the church, particularly when you're just close to election. So I don't know how, did you find anything towards preaching of peace, and then could that have influenced the sermons away from what you're looking for?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So this was part of the reason that we revisited all of the churches, and again, Nelson in particular can speak to that effort, but we revisited all these churches in 2017 because we thought, look, maybe we're not picking up all of this other, even explicitly political content because we're doing this outside of an election cycle. So we did find consistently across every single type of these churches, we found prayers for peace. There's no question. So the big difference, again, between the sermons that we observed in 2013 to 2016, and then the sermons and the worship services in 2017, is a much more frequent mention of, both just praying for the elections in general and praying that there would be peace. So that is consistent. What we did not, again, find We found, nevertheless, however, again, on this sort of schema, that even though each of these types of churches was discussing praying for peace, that they were also still exhibiting, when they moved on to discussions of Scripture, these kinds of metaphysical differences. That is like still a focus, even when it comes to praying for the elections and thinking about how are we going to get better governance in this country, etc. Often not been very explicit terms, but the discussions of Scriptures were still focused on individuals and individual characteristics, and that change will come. And again, similarly, similar themes here. So what we didn't find, we thought what might happen is when we moved from non-electoral period to an election period, that all of a sudden all of this stuff would go away, right? And instead we might see, even explicit mentions of particular candidates, right? We might see, Uhuru or Raila is like mentioned more often. We actually didn't see, we saw very little of that. We suspected it a little bit in advance because we thought, look, the churches might be wary about playing politics in that way in this cycle. And that's indeed what we found. Again, the consistent prayers for peace, but not a lot of other explicit political mobilization. Now that's not to say, again, that this may not have happened, and there are some news accounts, right, of politicians showing up in particular churches in the election season. Certainly we're not picking up every single church in the city, but on the whole, again, through this random sampling effort, we're trying to get as representative a picture as we can of all of the churches, rather than of those that happen to be picked up by the media. And overall, we see very little explicit political content even during that period. Yes.
Hi. My name is Edwin. Thank you for the presentation. I would like to perhaps ask you to make a comment about the point over there.
Yes.
On the mainline Protestants and the Catholics. I'm curious to know, how is it that they're able to articulate social issues at the structural level, and yet feel that they do have, and yet be limited in their own agency to perhaps effect change in the world, and perhaps compared to the first world trend there, the liberation theology, it's mainline Protestants and Catholics not feel that they have the capacity to effect change?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So in part, I'm going to hedge a little bit, because in the book, and I should say this as a sort of broad caveat of the book, in the book we don't do much in the way of explaining why these particular configuration of messages are appearing in a particular point in time. So we don't really explain why it is that we see this particular diagonal, right, or this particular quadrant in Kenya at this moment, or in many, again, we do some of this work in South Africa, we find the same patterns. We do this work and look at Accra and Lagos and Kampala, we see very similar. So an absence of kind of liberation theology that we saw in Latin America, or even in black churches in the US in mid 20th century. We don't really explain why that is. Instead, we kind of take the messages as they are and try and understand what the implications are, particularly for ordinary citizens who are attending these churches, what it means to be exposed to these different types of sermons. But what I can say is, descriptively, in terms of the content, we don't. So in liberation theology type sermons, we saw a focus on structural institutional issues. That is, like poverty, discrimination, inequality has to be addressed through institutional change and sort of state overhaul. But the message was also that individuals, again, sort of through strength of faith, similar to some of the elements of this, of the current Pentecostal sermons, that individuals can make a difference, especially if they come together. That these kinds of large-scale institutional changes can happen now. We will see this, in our lifetime, or at least, for our children. We don't see that kind of messaging very often in the mainline and Catholic sermons that we observed in this context. So on the one hand, an emphasis on factors external to the individual as sources of earthly problems, but also a lot of caution. So a lot of, understand that you are limited. You should do this. You should pursue change, but the rewards for that are that we get to come home, right? That we can get eternal life, right? They're not necessarily that this change is going to happen now or in the near future, but do the maintain your faith, etc. But the real rewards for this are not in this life, right? They're in the next. So we see that as an important descriptive distinction between here and there. But I can't really answer the question in the context of the book as to like why there isn't strong liberation theology in any particular context. Yes.
Hi, I'm Kali. I have a question concerning so did you consider the leaders' religious background, and for instance in Kenya, especially the president's religious background, with how people react or their citizens' reaction with change? Did you consider that? Because over the past years, most our presidents have been affiliated with Catholic, but now the reactions I've noted with the Catholic is not really in relation to the president's religious backgrounds.
Yeah, so this is what we try and do. Oops. Let's go back. Can I go back? So what we try and do here with the case study setup is to look across a variety of regime country cases, basically, and so that we get variation in precisely this, which in part, along with the other variables that I mentioned, which is whether the particular denomination has a president, right, or has a government dominated by members of that denomination. So when we're thinking about, Kenya, both under Kibaki and under Uhuru at the moment, we're thinking about this variable as the Catholics should be close to state power. That is, if it is proximity to state power that is influencing their modes of political engagement, if that's really the variable that's doing the work, rather than all of this stuff that I've tried to tell you about the content of their religious worldview and teaching, then we should see under these administrations, we think a reversal of the modes of political engagements across denominations. That is, we would expect Catholics all of a sudden to be like, less critical of, institutions or structures, and more about, we have somebody who shares our faith, who's in office. This is, promising for political change. And our argument is that across all of these cases, so not limited to Kenya, across all of these cases, we don't see that. Instead, despite this variation, despite coming sort of being more distant and then closer to state power depending on who's in office, we see similar modes of political engagement from members and religious leaders of these denominations. So our argument is that is doing less of the work than some of the other variables that we've tried to highlight. Yes. Hi.
Hi. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Sure.
I'm Monica.
Sorry, say that again?
My name is Monica.
Monica. Okay.
You've explored in depth and very thoroughly the sources, the conceptions of sources of problems in this world, as well as possibilities of change, of course, as your main quadrant. I'd be very curious to hear what you've found in terms of how problems of this world are conceived. What are the problems? What are these earthly problems in the world, and what differences might there be between different congregations? I imagine you've mentioned suffering, poverty, pretty generic things, and you also mentioned inequality, which is interesting because I imagine that some congregations might conceive of inequality as more of a problem than others, but I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about that, including, relatedly, you talked about the mainline Protestant and Catholic churches being more inclined to talk about systems and addressing systems as as ways of creating change, as well as sources of problems. I wonder if there's a difference in terms of what kinds of systems people are talking about as desirable, or as maybe more Christian or godly, or what kinds of systems are we working towards? As you use the word fair and unfair sometimes, and you also use the terms social justice. I'm very interested in terms of what that means, what those terms mean according to different congregations. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's a great question. We actually, another thing that we expected to see more variation in themes across types of congregations, that is along the lines of what Frida mentioned, socioeconomic status and education. We didn't find that. We also expected to see more variation in the sort of topics or issues or problems that were being identified across denominations. So I too had the sort of expectation that perhaps Pentecostal churches were sort of less likely to talk about inequality, because the prosperity gospel sort of implies maybe that people who are rich, you should be rich, and people who are poor should be poor, etc. And perhaps we see more discussion of inequality as problematic in the Catholic and mainline Protestant churches. We actually didn't find that per se. So I say these things in what the problems of this world are in general terms, in part because the sermons talk about them in general terms. So people across denominations talk about poverty and the sort of daily challenges of making ends meet, of trying to get education, of trying to move up in this world, sort of generically and consistently across sermons. And issues of national economic development are sort of consistently discussed across sermons. We found, issues of strife within the family, issues of the importance of the family, discussed equally across congregations. So we found actually very little in the way of topical differences across the sermons. I mean, of course, you're going to get some variation, because there's some variation across individual churches as to which passages of Scripture they're talking about, or we're visiting some on one Sunday rather than another. But when we were visiting mainline Protestant and Catholic churches and Pentecostal churches on the same Sundays, again, they would discuss similar passages of Scripture, similar topics, and yet this take on kind of the explanations for those problems and whether those problems are likely to be overcome in the short term, we found to be the distinctive differences. Coming from the U.S. context, we also, because when we present this to a U.S. audience, their questions are always, is it about abortion? Is it about homosexuality? Because these are the issues that do differ across churches in terms of what they're discussing from the pulpit in the U.S. context. Here, first of all, those are not usually the topics of sermons here, whereas they might be in a place where they've become politically and religiously charged, as in the U.S. And we get no sense that they're talking about those issues differently or taking different positions on those issues if they talk about them at all. So here it was a sort of identification of large-scale generic problems generically across the sermons, and a very different take on how to explain them is what we observed in sermons.
Hello, Gwyneth. So maybe a number of questions. When you went back to the slide on the state power and closeness to, but that, and then I'd be interested to find out your sources on, for instance, Pentecostal and the distant, under Kibaki and Kenyatta, and then see the idea of kind of characterizing a whole group and saying this was a general dynamic of the entire Catholic Church was close to, or the entire Pentecostal. Like what's a rubric? What's like the metric to say, okay, fine, this group was it a few pastors? I can, for instance, in the question of Pentecostals, I can pinpoint a number of pastors who are close to the Kenyatta administration. So what is, and then secondly, even the idea of because it's a compound, it's not just, there are a number of things that, for instance, the establishment of the missions, ever since the colonial times, had always taken an ethnic angle. If, for instance, was Ameru, I'd say Methodist and PCA, Kikuyu, and so how does that also, because we kind of are assuming that these religious teachings are one with the faith, in the sense one with the denominations, perhaps missing out on the possibility that they are actually shaped by political current affairs and that sort of thing. So if, let's say, it's my man in power and I'm a Methodist, I'll say, I'd come and I'd selectively pick out a teaching that favors me and may have some significant effect on, the studies and the kind of political behavior you're looking for. And then the idea of not explicitly political, like what defines that? So for instance, especially the past election, justice and peace were a huge thing, okay? And one can argue that peace was an explicitly political position, but if you're going to say it was only when a certain politician was mentioned, or only when a certain politician visited the congregation, visited the church and said a number of things to the congregation, I mean, what defines explicitly political? Because in the possibly, like, especially when you're talking about peace and justice, in the glaring in reaction to what had been happening, like if one said, okay, let's keep the peace, one could argue that was an explicitly political stand or stance. So and then where the religious teachings would come to support the peace, and it's one of those things that I've just been, thank you.
No, these are great, all of these are great questions. So I guess maybe I'll, let me say one thing first, which is I should have put up my email address here, but if anybody, so what I'm going to say in part to your questions about the case studies is that I would love, if anybody's interested, I would love to just send you also the chapter on the case studies, because there we're able to go into a bit more detail also about this particular sources that we're using, the interviews that we're using, and we try to take seriously, we talk about sort of group level behavior, but we're trying to be sensitive in that part of the book as well to the differences potentially between religious leaders' actions and then lay congregant actions. And there are examples in the book in which we see only a couple of religious leaders take a stand that deviates from this pattern. We again, on sort of average, try to look at sort of where most of the religious leaders from a particular congregation, or most of the congregants seem to be moving in a particular direction, allowing for the fact that there's going to be some variation within any given category. But what I would love is if you want to read through it and or skim through it even, and just see whether this strikes you as the right balance or approach or deeply problematic. We would love to hear from that. So this is for anybody. If you want to email me, it's just my name, gwyneth.mcclendon@nyu.edu. Please, I would be happy to send you any portions of the book to get the feedback. Now, on the question about explicitly political, this is really very important, because from our standpoint, so there is a literature within political science that focuses on explicit religious sermons or religious communication within churches, and the focus is on the mention of particular candidates, parties, particular issues, like the government needs to do X on abortion, or the government needs to do X on social welfare, or something like that. We see almost none of that across the sermons that we observe. Now, a trickier thing is to pick up on more coded political language within the services, which I think is part of what you're mentioning. So in the context of the 2017 election period that we observed, across churches we observe, so across these categories, we observe prayers for peace. But in some sermons or some services, we may also see some mention of issues of justice and credibility of elections, which, as you point out, is a sort of political decision about how to talk about that. Now, we find that this largely maps onto the schema that we see even in 2013 to 2016, which is that, again, issues of sort of justice and institutions and institutional credibility falling more among the mainline Protestant and Catholic sermons than in the Pentecostals. But we are, especially broadly speaking, when we're looking across contexts, not just in Kenya but outside of Kenya, I think the literature, and we are part of this, are less equipped always to pick up on all the coded ways in which politics might be discussed in a worship service. So what we can say is that contrary to what some of our colleagues have focused on, we don't see direct mobilization from the pulpit, right? That is, let's rally around this guy, right? This is our candidate. We need to, vote for this person en masse. But we do see, again, what we take to be positions on sort of how the world works and what the sources of earthly problems are, that, whether coded or not, have implications for how citizens then engage in politics when they've been exposed to those sermons. We also, again, don't really explain in the book where the messages come from. So some of what you hinted to are historical explanations also for where the sermons may be coming from. And we don't in the book argue that, we certainly take the position that sermons are written by religious leaders, and they may, there are religious leaders certainly who are writing them and delivering them from a position of faith, but also aware of the political and social context to which they speak. That may shape where these messages are coming from. What we want to argue is, regardless of where the messages come from, especially when we take this to the lab or we look at the survey evidence where we can sort of carefully control and compare people who are otherwise very similar, when people are exposed to sermons, it at least has an additional impact or recharging on their way of thinking about politics. So it can't be fully explained just by where their family comes from, where they're sort of historically, which ethnic group they're a part of, and the like. But we certainly allow for the possibility that the sermons themselves may have been shaped by the political and social context. But again, if people want to follow up, I'd be happy to send written materials as well for your review and feedback.
Do you have any more questions?
Hello, my name is Ilya. If I'm not mistaken, according to the census of 2009, around 700,000 Kenyans belong to various types of Orthodox churches, like Coptic or Greek Orthodox Church. Why these types of churches were not included in your research?
Yeah, so when we initially did the when we initially drew the list of churches from Google Earth, some of these did appear, but we didn't, I suppose in part because we're trying to also speak to debates about the trajectory and consequences of these particular denominations that are salient in various social science literatures. We made an explicit attempt to oversample Pentecostal churches, again, to try and get at these questions about, do we see variation across types of churches? Do we see variation, depending on, when these churches popped up and the like? But we didn't make an explicit effort to oversample the Orthodox churches of the type that you mentioned. As a result, they didn't end up in the sample, partly by chance, because we're randomly sampling in this way. And so this ends up being what we can speak to. Now, in the book, what we'd like to suggest is that we can't speak to every dimension of this schema, and there also may be other ways in which, or other sort of deep metaphysical questions that religious teachings speak to in ways that we haven't captured in this schema. And what we'd like to see researchers do is take some of the framework of what we're offering in the book and think about how widely it applies and to which religious traditions and which time periods might also fit into this schema, to think about the implications of that for political behavior.
I just thought I should follow up on the education and the socioeconomic status. What he just said about Meru people, for example, most of them being in Methodist Church. And what you hear about among people is that Methodist Church is for rich people. And is that right? Yeah. And what you see in most Pentecostal churches, even the sermons that we see on TV, and they're about hope. And this is immediate hope that is being offered to people really who feel they need something to be done immediately. And that speaks a lot to their socioeconomic status. And so I just wanted to know and to ask if you thought it was actually, because you said you asked the preachers about the combination of people in the variation of people in their churches, on their socio-economic status and their education. And I'm just wondering if whatever they told you was really representation of what was happening. And I also wanted to know if you took that a bit further when you sampled people that you brought to the lab. Did you ask them those questions? Because really that would be a direct answer to whatever you get from that would have been a direct answer to those kind of questions that I'm asking about. Because when you tell me you got it from the religious people, I'm a bit skeptical, knowing the kind of representation I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, so I'll say a couple of things. One, yes, so in the lab, I mean, it's a convenient sample, but the lab actually was set up to draw primarily, so it draws a lot from Kibera, but it draws from all over the city, but it actually was designed, their sampling was designed to oversample people who are of poor and less educated socioeconomic status. That's for a different purpose for why the lab was set up. So as a result, we have, again, people of very different denominations, Pentecostal, Catholic, and mainline Protestant, coming into the lab, most of whom are coming from poorer and less educated backgrounds. So what we can say is, when we talk about the kind of consequences of exposure to these sermons, not necessarily, again, where the sermons are coming from, right, which is sort of what you're hinting to a little bit about, like why the particular religious leaders may be delivering a message to a particular congregation. But when we bring in people of this socioeconomic status, of a variety of different denominations, we see these kinds of implications. So the kinds of consequences that I've argued for what exposure to these religious teachings means for political engagement is not a product of people's socioeconomic status, right? Instead, people of the very same socioeconomic status exposed to different types of sermons in this way engage in politics in a different way, or sort of look at the world in a different way. Now that said, I mean, again, I think our stereotypes from some of the literature also is that Pentecostal churches are for poor people, but there are really rich Pentecostal churches in this city that are also captured in our sample, and we visited those churches as well as smaller churches. There are tiny, poor Catholic parishes, right, in other parts of the city as well. We captured those as well. And so when I say we went and interviewed the pastors and the priests, but we also attended the worship services. And so what we're trying to do is corroborate what they say based on our own observations and the observations of our research assistants attending those churches. So we know where in the city they are. We know if they're in an informal settlement or they're in a posh part of town. We know we have done our own observations of who is attending the worship services. So they can't just outright lie to us and have us pick up on that. But that said, you're right, we can also speak to some of those questions in the lab because everybody who attends the lab has given all of that information when they signed up to be a participant. Yes?
Won't be very long. My name's Andrew Franklin. I think this sort of survey is fascinating because I have so little connection to it. And I think that researchers who don't have a lot of connection to churches, this opens up a whole new world. But would it be fair to say that what your survey says is that the churches really are not an element of social control here? In other words, I think after being here for 37 years, we see hustlers in churches. We have amazing amounts, most incredible amount of corruption now. And the same people who are involved in corruption go to church. The same people involved with murder go to church. We all know this. And so you're talking to an audience of people who are somewhat cynical, perhaps. Not so much, no, actually it's practical. And I get the impression that, at least in the survey, that the churches are not necessarily either supporting corruption or fighting corruption, in that in many ways the churches have now become somewhat irrelevant from a point of view of social action, unlike Latin America with the liberation theologies or the Pope. And that's just my...
Yeah, so... Yeah, I don't know that I would have thought about this as a study of whether the churches are a form of social control. But I will say, it is true that what we observe, again, when I say that the sermons are not explicitly political, they're not explicitly mentioning, we need to engage in X, Y, and Z anti-corruption campaign either. Again, these problems are discussed in fairly generic terms. And what we'd like to say, again, in many parts of the world, not just here, churches deliver messages. They communicate, again, what it means to have a relationship with God and how the physical and spiritual worlds work in terms that are often not explicitly political. And what we'd like to say is that even in those contexts, at least as political scientists, we should be paying attention to what happens in churches because it matters for how people understand the world and therefore how they engage in politics. We do, however, in the survey, the descriptive survey, I have to say, coming out of the U.S. context, people are very cynical about some of these types of churches. Extremely cynical. And we didn't want to come in and say, we're just going to assume that this is what the churches are doing, or these are the kinds of congregations that particular sermons are being preached to. Instead, we wanted to observe what that was. And I think for us, what comes out of this is, in my view, at least much less cynical, right? That these are not, they're also not, some of the stereotypes about Pentecostal sermons is that they're all about, getting rich quick and, really easy formula for that. But they're not, right? The sermons they're very broadly about how to overcome material suffering and enact, immediate change through faith. But many of them are not explicitly financial, right? Or not explicitly sort of in the sort of stereotypical cynical form of this. And I think, including actually I won't speak for Rachel, including in my life, religion is a very important part of many people's lives. And as a result, we should, understand that from sort of what's going on from a descriptive standpoint, but also think carefully about what the implications might be for forms of political engagement. So I think about this less as sort of a form of social control than as trying to understand sort of descriptively, empirically, about the implications of this for political engagement.
Thank you, Gwyneth, for such a thought-provoking and engaging presentation. Because of time, we're going to end here, but take this moment and give us the closing remarks. Okay. Then we'll end there.
Well, I think my closing remarks are mostly to thank you, and thank you for your attention and your patience. Again, my email address is, I know my name is like the worst name to spell. I can't even spell it correctly most of the time, but gwyneth.mcclendon@NYU, that is New York University, nyu.edu. Please follow up if you have questions or feedback or would like to see portions of the written manuscript. And again, thank you to all of you, and a special thank you to Nelson and Wangela, who actually helped with some parts of the research. So of course, any blame for the overall project should fall on us, not on them, but they did a lot of important legwork for the project. So thank you to them. Thank you for having me today. Asante sana, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.